I went hiking later in the day than I should have. I had planned to start in the morning, but I got delayed and didn't hit the trail until the afternoon. I figured I could still finish the loop before dark. I packed light, just water, a flashlight, and a couple of snacks. The trail was about 9 miles through thick woods with some steep elevation changes. I thought it would be a good workout and a quiet way to clear my head. The first half of the hike went smoothly. The forest was alive with birds. The air smelled like wet leaves, and the dirt trail was soft but solid. I climbed steadily, sweating and breathing heavy but enjoying the isolation. I only passed 2 other hikers early on, both heading the opposite way, and after that I didn't see another person. That was the part one liked best about hiking late in the day, the quiet. But I also knew it was a risk. By the time I reached the ridgeline, the sun was already sliding lower than I expected. The light had that golden color that only lasts a short while before turning gray. I checked my watch and realized I had made slower progress than I thought. I had about 4 miles left, and the sun would be gone in an hour. I decided to keep going because doubling back would take just as long. As I started down the descent, the woods thickened. The light vanished quicker than I liked. The trail cut through narrow switchbacks, with tall trees on both sides that blocked most of the sky. Shadows grew heavy across the ground, and I found myself pulling out my flashlight before it was fully dark. The beam lit a narrow cone ahead of me, and everything outside of it faded into black shapes and movement I couldn't track. Hiking at night is different. The air feels heavier, the silence thicker. Every sound, twigs snapping, leaves shifting, feels amplified. I tried to keep calm and steady, telling myself it was just animals, just the forest doing what it always did. But there was something about being alone out there after dark that pushed hard against my nerves. About half a mile down, I heard something behind me, a sharp crunch, heavy, not the kind of sound a squirrel or rabbit makes. I froze, holding the flashlight steady on the trail ahead, listening. My own breathing sounded too loud. For a moment, there was nothing, then another crunch, farther off but deliberate. It wasn't imagination. Something was moving in the trees behind me. I told myself it was probably a deer. They're big, they move heavy, and they're common in those woods. But the sound didn't fade away like it should have if the animal had been spooked by me. It seemed to stay at the edge of my hearing, matching my pace. I picked up speed. My boots hit the dirt harder. My breath came faster. The trail twisted tight, and every turn made me glance over my shoulder, swinging the flashlight back into the darkness. The beam lit up trunks, branches, brush, but nothing else. Still, the feeling wouldn't leave me. That sense that something was just out of reach, following. At one point, I stopped dead and turned the light behind me. I stood still, holding my breath, waiting. The woods were silent, too silent. Not even the usual night insects. My skin crawled. Then, just faintly, I heard the shuffle again, like weight pressing leaves. Not close, but not far enough either. I started moving fast, almost jogging. My pack bounced, my legs burned, but I didn't care. I wanted out of there. The trail seemed to stretch longer than I remembered, each turn leading to another slope, another shadowed stretch of woods. My flashlight caught roots and rocks, and I stumbled a few times, my heart racing at the thought of going down hard and being stuck. Then I saw something ahead, a break in the trees, the faint glimmer of moonlight on open ground. I pushed harder, lungs straining, until I came out into a small clearing. The trail cut straight through it, and for the first time in what felt like hours, I could see more than a few feet around me. I stopped in the middle, chest heaving, and spun slowly with the light. The trees at the edge of the clearing stood dark and silent. My beam swept across them, searching for any shape, any eyeshine. Nothing, just blackness pressing in. But that silence was worse than any sound. I didn't stay. I crossed the clearing quick and re-entered the trees on the far side. The trail dropped again, winding down toward the valley where I knew the parking lot was. My legs felt shaky from the adrenaline, but I kept moving, forcing myself not to stop again. The noises behind me never returned, but the fear stayed sharp. My flashlight beam shook with each step, the shadows jumping and twisting across the ground. Every branch overhead felt like it was bending toward me. Every dark hollow between the trees felt like it was hiding something. Finally, after what felt like forever, I saw the faint square shape of the trail sign near the lot. Relief washed over me so hard I almost laughed. I jogged the last stretch, the gravel crunching under my boots, until my car came into view. The sight of it sitting there under the weak glow of the lot's single light pole felt unreal, like a lifeline. I climbed in fast, locked the doors, and just sat there for a moment with the flashlight still in my hand. My chest rose and fell hard, sweat sticking to my shirt. I stared out at the black line of trees, half expecting to see movement, half daring myself to. Nothing stirred. On the drive home, my mind replayed everything. The sounds, the silence, the feeling of being watched. I kept trying to convince myself it was just a deer, or maybe even my own nerves tricking me. But I know what I felt. I wasn't just imagining it. Something was there, following at a distance, never showing itself, never getting too close. The thing that gets me most is how quiet the woods went when it started. Forests at night aren't silent, not unless something larger is moving through them. That silence wrapped around me like a warning, and it hasn't left my head since. I still hike, but I don't push it late anymore. I stick to daylight, to familiar trails, to times when I know there'll be other people around. Because being out there alone, with something tracking your steps in the dark, is a kind of fear that doesn't fade. It stays with you long after you've made it home, long after you've locked the doors. It lingers at the edges of memory, ready to remind you just how small and vulnerable you really are in the middle of the woods. And every time I think back to that night, I hear myself whispering the same thought I had when I realized I wasn't alone out there. Holy shit, why am I here at this hour? I set out early that morning with the kind of confidence you only feel when you've planned a hike for weeks and finally get to follow through on it. The air was still cool, and a thin mist clung to the lower trees as I parked and shouldered my pack. I had read trip reports online about the trail. A few people mentioned it was quiet, not well-traveled compared to the bigger ones nearby, and that was exactly what I wanted. I wasn't looking for crowds or chatter, just a stretch of woods where I could move at my own pace and let the sound of the earth take over. The trail started wide and worn, the dirt packed down by years of boots. After a mile or so, though, it narrowed. Roots spread across it like veins, and the undergrowth started creeping closer. I could tell fewer people came this way. The forest was thick, mostly pine and spruce, with scattered birch breaking up the green with their white trunks. The smell of damp moss was strong, the kind that sticks in your nose for hours. Every so often I'd pass a small clearing where sunlight punched through and lit up the ferns, but for the most part, it was shadowed and hushed. About 2 hours in, I noticed how quiet it really was. I hadn't seen anyone else since I'd left the parking lot, and I hadn't even heard distant voices or dogs like I sometimes did on other hikes. No planes overhead, no far-off hum of a road. Just the steady crunch of my boots and the occasional snap of a twig when a squirrel darted through the underbrush. I told myself that was what I came for, solitude, but I started realizing how unusual it felt. In the back of my mind, I wondered if I had chosen a place that wasn't just quiet but forgotten. The trail markers weren't great. Some were faded blazes on tree trunks. Others were small wooden signs nailed years ago and weathered so badly that the paint was peeling off. A few times I stopped to check my GPS just to be sure I hadn't drifted off onto an old logging road. The map showed I was still on track, though winding toward a ridgeline that offered views over the valley. That kept me pushing forward. Around midday, I stopped near a dry creek bed for lunch. I sat on a fallen log, ate a sandwich, and listened. At first it was peaceful, but as I sat there, I noticed how still the woods seemed. Even birdsong had dropped off. Usually, when you sit still long enough, you hear the small rustling of things going about their lives. Birds, chipmunks, bugs. But here, there was nothing. The silence started to feel thick, like it pressed against me. I tried to shrug it off and told myself it was just midday lull, when animals hunkered down. Still, I didn't linger long after finishing. When I got back on the trail, it grew harder to follow. The tread faint, the blazes spaced further apart. I kept having to slow down and scan the trees ahead for the next marker. At one point, I realized I hadn't seen a blaze in almost half a mile. My GPS still showed a line, but the accuracy wasn't perfect under the thick canopy, and the trail I was walking on looked less and less like an actual path. The ground turned rougher, with patches of stone and tangled roots. I told myself it was just an old section of the trail, not maintained. Then I saw something strange. Off to the right, through the trees, was what looked like the remains of a fire ring. Curious, I stepped over. Sure enough, there were blackened stones in a circle and bits of charred wood. But what unsettled me wasn't the fire itself. It was how old and unkempt it looked. The stones were half sunk into the dirt, moss had crept over them, and the burnt wood was soft with rot. It had clearly been there for years, maybe decades, forgotten by whoever had last camped here. I couldn't help but wonder what kind of person had set it up and why this far-off trail. Backtracking to the faint path, I tried to shake it off, but I kept seeing little things. Another 100 yards and there was a tree with deep gashes in the bark, as if someone had hacked at it with a hatchet long ago. A little further, I passed what looked like an old boot sole half buried in the soil. It was crumbling with age, almost eaten by the earth. Each time I found something, I felt a little less like I was walking on an ordinary forgotten trail and more like I was crossing through a place people had tried to erase. The air seemed to get heavier the deeper I went. Not in temperature, but in weight, like the stillness was pressing harder on me. I realized I hadn't drunk enough water and stopped to take a sip. As I stood there, pack half off my shoulders, I thought I heard something behind me. Not close, but distant. A crack of wood, like something heavy had stepped wrong. I froze and listened. Nothing. My pulse picked up, and I found myself scanning the trees over and over. After a minute, I forced myself to move on. I didn't want to stay still long enough for my nerves to eat me alive. By late afternoon, the trail was gone. It just stopped. 1 second, there were faint signs of foot traffic. Flattened ferns, a blaze on a tree, and then nothing but unbroken forest. My GPS showed the line continuing straight ahead, but when I looked up, all I saw were trees and brush. I walked in the direction it indicated for maybe 50 yards, but the ground got worse, uneven and rocky. Finally, I had to admit I wasn't on a trail anymore. That realization hit hard. The sun was already lowering, and I was at least 6 miles from my car. My only choice was to turn back. I retraced my steps, trying to pay close attention, but the woods all looked the same. The trees, the moss, the rocks, everything blended together. Twice I had to double back when I realized I'd drifted off my original line. It was during one of those corrections that I found something that made my stomach drop. On the ground, tucked against the base of a tree, was a backpack. It was dirty and torn, the fabric sun-bleached and stiff. The zippers were rusted, and when I nudged it with my boot, one strap crumbled away. It had clearly been there a long time. I didn't open it. I didn't want to. Something about it felt wrong, like I was intruding. From that moment on, every step back felt worse. The woods seemed darker even though the sun hadn't set yet. I kept hearing faint sounds, snaps, rustles, but never close, never clear. It was enough to keep my nerves raw. My mind started running through possibilities. Someone had abandoned that pack. Someone had made those marks on the trees. Someone had camped in those spots. None of it felt like ordinary recreation. It all felt off, like I was brushing against pieces of something I shouldn't see. I pushed harder to get back, sweat soaking through my shirt. My legs burned, but I barely noticed. All I wanted was to reach the wider, safer part of the trail again. Took hours. By the time I finally recognized a spot I had passed earlier in the day, the dry creek bed where I'd eaten lunch, the light was almost gone. Relief washed over me, but it was sharp, nearly painful. I hiked the last stretch in near darkness, barely seeing the trail under my feet, stumbling often. When I finally stepped into the parking lot and saw my car sitting alone in the gloom, I felt something I hadn't felt all day: safety. I tossed my pack in the back, climbed into the driver's seat, and just sat there with my hands on the wheel, catching my breath. On the drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. The fire rings, the old pack, the silence that had clung to the place. I couldn't shake the sense that there was history buried in those woods, history no one wanted to talk about. And I knew that if I ever mentioned where it was, people would dig and dig until they uncovered something. Reports of someone disappearing or old news stories about hikers who never came back. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the backpack against the tree, rotting into the dirt, waiting for someone to find it. The Appalachian Trail in Pennsylvania is known for one thing above all else: rocks. It's not an exaggeration when people call it Rocksylvania. You step from one jagged chunk to another for miles, each stone waiting to twist your ankle or bruise the bottom of your feet. That's where I found myself on a bright but cool afternoon, working through one of the nastier stretches of trail, the kind where your pace slows to a crawl and every step demands focus. I was alone, just a day hike. My pack was light, mostly water, snacks, and a small first aid kit. The air was crisp, filtered sunlight pushing through the trees, and the sound of dry leaves crunching underfoot with every cautious step. I hadn't seen another hiker all day, which wasn't unusual for that section of trail. The solitude felt good, though a little heavy. Long silences in the woods tend to feel that way after a few hours. Then I heard it, the steady click of trekking poles. First faint, then louder. The sound carried oddly through the woods, the rhythm sharp against the natural quiet. I slowed, scanning ahead through the trees, and sure enough, a figure came into view. It took me a second to process what I was seeing. He was old, easily late 60s or even older. His skin was weathered and sunburnt in patches, wrinkled like leather that had seen too many summers. He wore a broad-brimmed hat, a backpack strapped tight, and in each hand a trekking pole that stabbed into the rocks with surprising speed and strength. That was it. No shirt, no pants, no shoes, nothing else. Completely naked except for his gear and his hat. His bare feet picked their way across the rocks like it was the easiest thing in the world. I slowed even more, partly out of surprise, partly out of a deep unease that settled in my gut. I had seen a lot of strange things on the trail over the years. Odd characters, people with eccentric clothing choices, hikers muttering to themselves. But this was something else. Seeing someone that exposed on one of the roughest sections of the At felt surreal, almost wrong. When he reached me, he didn't pause, didn't acknowledge the obvious. He greeted me like an old friend, with the kind of warm friendliness that made me wonder if maybe I was the strange one for reacting at all. His voice was rough but steady, and before I even answered, he had already launched into a stream of chatter. I fell into step with him almost without meaning to. He moved quickly despite his age, bare feet finding purchase on sharp rocks that would have sliced mine open without boots. His poles clicked like a metronome, keeping him upright, steady. He talked as he went, about the trail, about the weather, about places he'd hiked before. He spoke with a kind of energy that belied his appearance, like the trail itself was keeping him alive. The strangest part wasn't that he was naked. It was how completely he ignored the fact. I asked lightly at first about his lack of clothing, something like whether it was more comfortable that way. He didn't respond. Not a pause, not a laugh, not even a glance. He simply kept talking about the ridge line up ahead, the trail shelters, the way Pennsylvania rocks tested every hiker's patience. I tried again later, more direct, and again it was like he hadn't heard me. He filled the silence with more stories, anecdotes, random thoughts. We hiked like that for miles. I was uneasy, but his voice kept filling the quiet, and for some reason, I didn't break away. There was something compelling about him, like if I left too soon, I might miss something important, even if I couldn't say what. The way he moved over the rocks bothered me most. His feet, cracked and toughened from who knows how many miles, landed on jagged stone without hesitation. I watched closely, expecting a flinch, a stumble, blood, anything. But he seemed immune. Each step was precise, practiced. It was as if his feet had adapted into something beyond normal skin and bone. The woods felt different with him there. Usually, when you meet another hiker, you feel a small relief, a reminder that you aren't entirely alone out there. But walking with him didn't bring comfort. It was the opposite. The silence of the woods mixed with his voice created a strange, heavy tension. Every time I looked at him, the back of my neck prickled. His body was frail, almost skeletal, yet he moved with endurance that didn't match his age. After a while, I realized I was sweating even though the air was cool. My heart was beating faster than it should have been for such an ordinary stretch of trail. It wasn't the exertion, it was being near him. I kept imagining what it would be like to run into him out here at night, in the dark woods with no one else for miles. That thought alone made my stomach twist. Finally, after 3 miles or so, I told myself I'd had enough. I had no real reason to keep following him, and the unease had grown too strong to ignore. I slowed, let him pull ahead, and then stopped. He didn't turn to look at me, didn't ask why I was stopping, didn't even give a wave. He just kept moving, bare feet on sharp stone, poles clicking in steady rhythm, his hat bobbing above his gaunt shoulders. I stood there, watching until the trees swallowed him. The sound of his poles faded until all I could hear again was the breeze and the occasional call of a bird. The normal silence of the trail returned, but it didn't feel the same. It felt heavier, darker, like he had left something behind just by passing through. On the walk back, I kept replaying it. His leathery skin, his silence when I asked questions, the way he spoke endlessly but revealed nothing about himself. No name, no destination, no explanation. Just a constant stream of talk to fill the air, like he couldn't bear the silence. And the fact that he moved over rocks barefoot with no hesitation still sits with me years later. When I finally made it back to my car at the trailhead, I sat there for a long time, trying to shake the image of him. Naked, hat tilted low, trekking poles stabbing into the rocks, carrying on as if he'd been walking that trail forever and would keep walking long after I was gone. That day taught me something unsettling. The wilderness has its own dangers, weather, wildlife, injury. But sometimes the strangest, most unnerving thing you can encounter is another person. People you can't explain, people who don't fit. And once you see them, you realize how vulnerable you really are out there, miles from safety. I never saw him again, though hikers swap stories, and sometimes I wonder if others have crossed his path. Maybe he's still out there, weaving over rocks barefoot, talking to anyone who'll listen, ignoring the questions that really matter. If he is, I hope he stays far from me. The trail was never the same after that. Every time I hear trekking poles click in the distance, I wonder if it's him. Still wandering, still strange, still impossible to forget. I was out hiking late one afternoon when it happened. The trail wasn't anything extreme, just a steady climb through a forested ridge that I'd been meaning to check out. The kind of hike that's long enough to wear you out, but not so remote that you'd think twice about going alone. The sun had been dropping lower, filtering through the trees in streaks of pale light. The forest was thick with pine and hardwoods, and the air had that still, heavy quality that comes before dusk. I was maybe 4 miles in, with plans to circle back before dark, when I first heard it. At first, I thought it was wind playing tricks on me. A faint sound carried through the trees, so soft I couldn't be sure if I was imagining it. But then, as I stopped to adjust my pack and took my earplugs out, habit when hiking alone, I realized it was music. Not blasting, not from a speaker, just faint, almost like it was drifting on the air. The kind of sound you get when someone is far off and playing something without amplification. It didn't make sense. I was in the middle of nowhere, the parking lot miles behind me, and the nearest town even farther. But there it was, light, melodic, almost cheerful. Something with a rhythm like a fiddle or maybe a flute. I froze on the trail, straining to listen. The longer I stood there, the more distinct it became. Notes rising and falling, almost playful, echoing faintly through the trees. It wasn't close, but it wasn't impossibly far either. The direction was hard to pin down. It seemed to come from somewhere down the slope to my right, beyond the marked path, down where the woods grew darker and the terrain dropped toward a gully. For a moment, I felt this weird pull, curiosity more than anything. My first thought was hikers, maybe a group camping down off-trail, maybe playing around a fire. But the sound was strange. It wasn't what I'd expect out here. It wasn't a guitar or someone's phone speaker. It was old-fashioned, airy, almost eerie. I stood there for what felt like a long time, just listening. And then my gut started to turn. Something about it didn't feel right. The hairs on the back of my neck lifted. The longer I stood there, the more the music didn't sound like people having fun. It sounded like something that shouldn't be in the middle of those woods. It was too steady, too isolated, too unnatural for where I was. I told myself not to be stupid. Don't follow it. Just keep going. I tightened my straps and walked on, forcing myself to ignore it. But it followed me, not literally, but the sound carried through the trees no matter how far I went. Sometimes it faded, almost gone, and then it would drift back stronger, like it was just beyond reach. Every time it swelled again, I had to fight the urge to stop, to turn downhill and figure it out. That's what scared me most. Not the sound itself, but the feeling it gave me. Like it wanted me to follow, like it was pulling at something in me. The trail grew rockier, twisting up toward a ridge, and I picked up my pace. My boots crunched over loose stone, and my breathing grew heavy. But every time I thought I'd left it behind, the music would slip back between the trees. Never closer, never farther, just there. By the time the light started dropping fast, I was jumpy. My nerves were raw, my head on a swivel. The woods seemed darker than they should have been, shadows stretching longer between the trunks. The music was still there, faint and teasing, and I realized my fists were clenched so tight around my trekking poles that my knuckles ached. I thought about camping, but the idea of setting up a tent while that sound drifted around me was unbearable. I decided I'd push the miles and make it back to my car, even if it meant hiking the last stretch in the dark. At least the trail was straightforward. The deeper it got into dusk, the stranger it felt. The forest sounds, birds, insects, the usual chatter had gone quiet, too quiet. My own footsteps were loud in the silence, and every time I paused, the music seemed sharper, like it was filling the space the woods should have occupied. At one point, I stopped dead. I had the sick feeling that if I turned my head too quickly, I'd see someone standing just beyond the trees, watching. The thought of looking made my skin crawl, so I kept my eyes on the trail and forced myself forward. My chest felt tight, my mouth dry. When full dark hit, I pulled my headlamp on. The cone of light cut through the trail ahead, bouncing as I moved. The music was still there, fainter now but steady, floating on the night air. My heart hammered with every step, my legs burning as I pushed faster, almost jogging over uneven terrain. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably less than one, I saw the faint outline of the trailhead sign ahead. Relief washed over me so hard I almost stumbled. My car was the only one left in the lot, the metal glinting faintly under the pale light of the moon. As soon as I slid inside and slammed the door, the silence hit me. I sat there for a minute, breathing hard, headlights off, just listening. Nothing. No music, no sound but my pulse in my ears. I drove out, gravel spitting under my tires, and only when the road curved far enough away from the trail did I finally start to calm down. Later, at home, I tried to explain it away. Maybe someone really had been camping down there with an instrument. Maybe the sound carried weirdly through the valleys. Maybe I'd let myself spiral. But deep down, I knew better. There had been something wrong about that sound. Something that worked its way under my skin and tugged. That night, I lay awake thinking about how easy it would have been to step off the trail, just to follow it a little, just to see. I thought about how no one would have known where I'd gone if I hadn't come back. I'm glad I didn't. That decision, to keep my feet on the trail and ignore it, might have been the most important one I've ever made. And now, whenever I'm deep in the woods and the wind shifts just right, I listen hard. If I ever hear music again, I know what I'll do. I'll keep walking. No matter how curious I get, no matter how much it tugs, I'll stay on the path. Because whatever is out there, I don't need to know. That night taught me one thing for certain. Some sounds in the woods are better left unfollowed. And if you hear them, the smartest move you can make is to get out while you still can. I was in my early 20s when it happened. Back then, bushwalking in New South Wales was something I did every other weekend. The Australian bush always had a pull on me. The smell of eucalyptus in the air, the crunch of dry leaves underfoot, the strange silence that was never really silent at all. That day, it was me and a friend, packs on our backs, just doing a day walkout in an area that wasn't exactly remote but not well-traveled either. It was the kind of place where, once you'd left the dirt road and got onto the tracks, you might not see another person the entire day. We'd been walking for a couple of hours, just following the narrow trail through scrub and bushland. The sun was hot, cutting through gaps in the canopy, and the air felt dry enough to burn your throat if you didn't sip water constantly. We weren't pushing for distance, just moving slow, enjoying the day. But at some point, we decided to veer off the main path. That's something I used to do a lot. Wander a little way into the bush just to see what was there. Sometimes you'd find nothing. Other times, you'd stumble onto something strange. That's how we found it. It was maybe 200, 300 yards off the main trail, tucked away in a clearing you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. The ground flattened out, and in the middle of it was this odd structure made out of rocks. It wasn't natural. You could tell instantly it had been put there by someone built with intention. It looked almost like a low platform, rough but deliberate. Stones stacked, not just tossed. The shape wasn't neat enough to be anything official, like from the Parks Department, but it also wasn't random. Someone had made it for a purpose. We stood there, staring at it, neither of us saying much. I remember feeling a kind of discomfort straight away. It wasn't just curiosity. It was the feeling you get when you stumble across something you weren't meant to see. I walked around it looking closer. The rocks were dark, some of them chipped and sharp-edged, others smooth. They'd been hauled from different places, that much was obvious, because the ground around didn't have rocks like those. I didn't see any markings or signs, nothing to explain it. No bottles, no signs of camping, no ashes from a fire. Just this platform of stone sitting alone in the clearing. We didn't stick around long. After a minute or two of circling it and exchanging uneasy glances, we shrugged it off and walked back to the track. At the time, we joked about it being some weird bush art project or maybe something old and forgotten, though neither of us really believed that. Something about it left me unsettled, but I pushed it aside and forgot about it soon after. Months went by. Life moved on. I didn't think of that structure again until the news broke. Ivan Milat. The name was everywhere, papers, TV, radio. A string of backpackers had gone missing in New South Wales over the years, and now the police had arrested a man for their murders. As the details came out, it turned into one of the biggest criminal cases Australia had ever seen. 7 victims confirmed, though the talk was always that there could have been more. Young men and women, travelers from overseas, picked up while hitchhiking, never seen alive again. It was the footage that hit me hardest. I was half watching a current affairs program one evening when they cut to video of a crime scene. The reporter's voice droned on about altars found near several of the shallow graves. The screen showed a grainy shot of one of them. My stomach dropped. It was the same rough platform of rocks in a clearing. The same shape, the same unnatural stack. My mind flashed back instantly to that day with my friend, standing there in the bush, staring at that exact kind of thing. My whole body went cold. The report said those altars were found typically no more than a few hundred yards from where the bodies were buried. They didn't know exactly what they meant. Some thought they were places Milat or whoever else was involved went to, maybe to plan, maybe for ritual, maybe just as some kind of marker. Nobody really knew, but the fact remained. They were there and we had found one. I called my friend straight after seeing the footage. The first words out of his mouth when I mentioned it were, "That's what we saw." No hesitation. He remembered it just as clearly. We sat there on the phone, both rattled, both realizing what we had wandered across that day. The worst part was the timing. When we had found that platform, some of the murders hadn't even been discovered yet. We had been walking in the same bush where victims were still lying undiscovered in shallow graves. We didn't know it at the time, but the ground under our boots might have been hiding something horrific. After Milat's conviction, the theories kept swirling. Everyone knew he'd done it, but the police were never fully convinced he acted alone. Too many details didn't line up neatly. They believed another person, maybe more than one, had helped lure or trap the victims. They just couldn't prove it. That thought haunts me more than anything else. When I think back to that strange altar of rocks, I don't just think of Milat. I think about who else might have been there. Was it a place where he sat with someone else, planning? Was it built by his own hands, or by another set of hands that never got caught? Did we stumble across something that tied into the crimes more directly than anyone will ever know? I replay it often, the silence of that clearing, the way we both felt unsettled without knowing why, the sense that we were seeing something we shouldn't. I can't help but wonder, if we had walked another few hundred yards in a different direction, what would we have found? A shallow grave? The remains of one of those missing backpackers? It makes my stomach turn even now. Bushwalking used to feel safe to me. Sure, there were snakes, spiders, the risk of getting lost, but those were natural dangers. That day changed how I saw the bush forever. It wasn't just nature out there, it was people too. People with dark intentions. People hiding things. I've never gone back to that spot. Never wanted to. The thought of retracing those steps, of walking off trail into that clearing again, is enough to make me feel sick. It's not just the memory of what we saw, it's the knowledge of what it meant. That we had brushed up against something tied directly to horror. That we were that close, without knowing it, to the shadow of Australia's worst serial killer. And the part that keeps me awake sometimes, even years later, is knowing the police never closed every door on that case. They caught Milat, but they believed there was someone else. Maybe more than one. Someone who built those platforms of stone. Someone who knew what was buried in those woods. Someone who never faced justice. Every time I hear about a missing hiker or backpacker in Australia, my mind goes back to that clearing, that altar of rocks, and the silence of the bush pressing in. I know what I saw, and I know what it meant. And I know, deep down, that some things are better left unfound. But I also know that day we walked out lucky, because some people who wandered into those same woods never walked out at all. When I thru-hiked the Appalachian Trail in 2012, I expected to see and experience a lot of strange things. The AT has this way of stripping life down to basics, but at the same time, it exposes you to the oddest corners of human behavior. You're out there long enough, and you start meeting people you'd never cross paths with in ordinary life. Trail angels, eccentrics, wanderers, recluses. Some encounters are inspiring, others unsettling. One in particular has stuck with me over the years more than most. I'd been on the trail for a couple of months by the time it happened. I'd fallen into the rhythm of long days, tired feet, and endless green tunnels of trees. You hear about certain characters out on the AT before you ever meet them. Legends passed along by other hikers at shelters or hostels. The Ice Cream Man was one of those stories. Supposedly, there was this old man who lived right off the trail. If you happened to pass by his place at the right time, he'd give you ice cream. Nobody could tell me much more than that, and the details were fuzzy. Some hikers swore he was just a sweet old guy. Others said he was eccentric to the point of unsettling. I didn't know what to expect. The day I stumbled across his place, it was hot. One of those muggy, oppressive days in late summer when the air feels heavy and the sweat doesn't stop. My shirt stuck to my back, my pack straps dug into my shoulders, and I'd been running low on water. The thought of ice cream in that heat was almost too good to be true. Sure enough, the trail spit me out near a small dirt road, and just a short way off was a modest little house. I might have walked right past it if not for a hand-painted sign propped near the road that said simply, "Ice cream." The letters were uneven, faded, but clear enough. I hesitated for a minute, then curiosity and hunger got the better of me. I followed the path up to the house. The place was old, not falling apart, but definitely lived in for decades. The paint was peeling in spots, the porch sagged a little, and a collection of mismatched chairs sat scattered across the yard. It didn't look threatening, but something about it felt oddly still, like time didn't move quite the same there. I knocked on the door. After a few moments, it creaked open, and an old man appeared. He wore thick glasses that magnified his eyes to an unnatural size, making it hard to tell exactly where he was looking. His hair was thin and white, his frame wiry but upright. Without saying a word, he reached out and took my hand. Not forcefully, but firmly enough that I felt no choice but to go along, and guided me inside. The air in the house was cool compared to the heavy heat outside, but it smelled faintly of dust and something sweet, maybe old fruit or sugar. The living room was cluttered. Stacks of books, knickknacks on every surface, faded pictures on the walls. He didn't pause there, just led me straight to the kitchen and sat me down at a small wooden table. Then, without a word, he disappeared into the next room. I sat there, unsure what I'd walked into, but before long he returned. In his hand was an orange cream popsicle, the kind I hadn't had since childhood. He placed it in front of me like it was a gift. I took it, peeled the wrapper, and the cold hit my tongue like salvation. For a moment, it was perfect, but then he did something that shifted the whole mood. He pulled out a thin, worn children's book, Where the Wild Things Are. Without asking, he sat across from me, opened the book, and began to read aloud. His voice was soft, raspy, and deliberate, each word drawn out as if he hadn't spoken to anyone in a long time. His magnified eyes flicked between the page and me, and I sat frozen, the popsicle melting in my hand, dripping onto the napkin he'd set down without me noticing. It wasn't threatening, not exactly, but it was strange, deeply strange. I was an adult, sitting in a stranger's kitchen, being read a children's story as if I were 5 years old. The way he read made it feel like a ritual, like something he'd done before, maybe countless times with hikers who stopped by. The house was silent except for his voice, the ticking of a clock somewhere behind me, and the faint hum of the refrigerator. As the story went on, I found myself glancing around the room, noting the details. The kitchen walls were lined with old wallpaper, yellowed and peeling in places. A stack of mail sat untouched on the counter, months old by the looks of it. A glass jar full of marbles sat on the windowsill, catching the last of the afternoon sun. Everything about the space was trapped in another time. I finished the popsicle slowly, the sugar and cold turning sour in my stomach as unease crept up on me. He kept reading, steady, as if I wasn't really there but just another part of his ritual. When he reached the end of the book, he closed it gently, set it on the table, and finally looked at me directly. His magnified eyes locked on mine for a moment too long, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Then, without a word, he stood, walked to the door, and opened it wide. The message was clear. I stood, thanked him awkwardly, and stepped outside into the fading daylight. The heavy warmth of the evening hit me again, but it felt like freedom. I walked back down the path, back onto the trail, and didn't look back until I was well past the bend that hid the house from view. As I hiked on, my mind replayed the whole encounter. On the surface, nothing bad had happened. He'd given me ice cream, read me a story, and sent me on my way. But something about the experience dug into me, left me unsettled. Maybe it was the way he held my hand without asking. Maybe it was the ritualistic tone of his reading. Or maybe it was the realization that he'd probably done this exact same thing with countless other hikers, each one sitting at that kitchen table, eating a popsicle while he read them Where the Wild Things Are. I thought about how far I was from anyone else I knew, how easy it would have been for me to just disappear, and how little anyone would know of where I'd gone. The at is full of kindness and generosity, but also strangeness, and that day reminded me how fine the line can be between the two. By the time I made camp that night, I couldn't shake the image of his magnified eyes and the sound of his voice reading those words meant for children. I told myself it was harmless, just a quirky old man with his own way of showing hospitality. But even now, years later, when I think back on my through hike, that moment stands out sharper than the mountain views, sharper than the storms and the wildlife encounters. It taught me something I never forgot. Out there on the trail, kindness and danger sometimes wear the same face, and you never really know which one you're sitting across from until it's too late. I had gone out for a long hike in a part of the forest I wasn't too familiar with. It wasn't a marked trail, but I had been following a series of old logging roads that cut through the hills. The air was cool and damp, and the ground was still soft from rain the day before. My boots sank slightly into the mud with each step, leaving deep prints behind me. I liked hiking off-trail because it felt like I was pushing deeper into places that most people didn't bother going. The downside was always the silence. No distant chatter, no faint sounds of traffic. Just the wind through the branches, an occasional bird, and the noise of my own footsteps. It was freeing, but it also carried that heavy weight in the back of my mind. The thought that if anything went wrong, I was alone. I had been walking for hours when I noticed something strange up ahead. Through the gaps in the trees, I caught sight of a shape that looked unnatural. At first, I thought it was a fallen tree, but the lines were too straight. As I got closer, I realized it was a pile of wood. Not just a few branches stacked carelessly, but an actual mound, neatly arranged in a rough pyramid. It was made of logs, branches, and cut limbs, all broken down to similar lengths. Some still had bark, others looked stripped. The way they were stacked made it clear it wasn't just storm debris that had landed that way. Someone had taken time to arrange it. The pile was taller than me, maybe 8 feet at the peak, and about 20 feet wide. The logs were set in crisscross layers the way you'd build a bonfire. But it wasn't burned. No blackened pieces, no ash around it. The ground near it was covered in pine needles and leaves, undisturbed except for where the pile sat. I stopped a few feet away and just stared at it. It made no sense being there. I hadn't seen signs of recent logging. There were no tire tracks, no cut stumps nearby. It was like whoever built it had dragged all the wood from other places and left it in this one random spot. The forest was quiet around me. Too quiet. I hadn't noticed until I stopped, but the usual small noises, birds calling, squirrels moving, were absent. I walked around the pile slowly, my pack shifting on my shoulders as I tried to take it all in. On the far side, I noticed the ends of some logs were sawed clean, while others were just snapped, jagged. Some looked like they'd been there longer than others, gray and weathered, while a few were fresh with lighter wood showing. It was like the pile had been built over time, with someone adding to it piece by piece. I don't know why, but I felt a sense of unease standing there. A pile of wood in the middle of nowhere shouldn't have bothered me, but something about it felt wrong. My brain kept trying to make sense of it, and it couldn't. I imagined the work it would take to drag all those logs and branches out there. The effort was strange. There was no cabin nearby, no campsite, nothing. Just this mound sitting silent in the middle of the woods. I didn't touch it. I just stood for a while, studying it, listening. The longer I stood there, the more I felt like I was being watched. Not by something supernatural, but just in that very human sense of being exposed, like someone was nearby, out of sight. My skin prickled. I couldn't hear anything, but my gut told me not to linger. I backed away slowly, eyes fixed on the pile, until I was far enough to turn and continue moving. For the next couple of miles, I couldn't shake it from my mind. Every time I stopped to sip water or look at my map, I felt like the woods had grown heavier, more still. I kept glancing back even though I couldn't see the pile anymore. I told myself it was probably just brush clearing, farmers or land workers stacking debris after thinning the woods. But it didn't feel like that. The effort behind it seemed obsessive, not practical. Later in the afternoon, I came across another one. Smaller, maybe half the size, but built in the same crisscross fashion. This one was tucked deeper between trees, harder to spot unless you walked right into it. My stomach dropped when I realized there wasn't just one pile. Someone had been building several. I circled this one too, scanning the ground. The forest floor was torn up in places, like branches had been dragged through. But again, no vehicle tracks, no footprints clear enough to follow. I crouched low and brushed aside some leaves. The soil was disturbed, but rain had smoothed it over. Whatever had been here wasn't recent, but not ancient either. I started moving faster after that. My boots pounded the dirt, my breath louder in my ears than I wanted it to be. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, but the unease wouldn't let go. The piles weren't random. They were placed deliberately. I began scanning the forest around me constantly, half expecting to see another one, or worse, someone standing still between the trees. The third pile I found was the one that broke me. It was smaller again, more of a heap, but on top of it was something different. Among the branches was a torn piece of fabric, tangled and caught on a splintered log. It looked like a shred from a shirt or jacket, faded but definitely not from an animal. I stared at it, my chest tight, every nerve screaming that I needed to leave. I didn't even approach it fully this time. Just the sight of that cloth was enough. I turned around and started heading back the way I'd come, retracing my steps as best I could. My legs felt heavy, but I pushed hard, focusing on the ground, the tree shapes, anything that kept me moving. I hated how quiet the woods were. Even the wind seemed to have died. Hours later, when I finally reached the point where the trail widened into the old logging road, I didn't stop. I kept walking until I saw the faint glint of my car through the trees. Relief hit me so hard I almost laughed. I climbed in, locked the doors, and sat there gripping the wheel, my hands shaking. On the drive back, I kept thinking about the piles. They weren't campfires. They weren't clean-up debris. They felt like something else entirely. Markers, boundaries, or maybe just the work of someone who didn't want to be found. I'll never know, but I do know I won't go back to that stretch of woods again. Even now, when I hike, I find myself scanning the trees for unnatural shapes. And every time I see stacked branches or logs, even in ordinary places where they're supposed to be, my stomach tightens. Because out there, in the middle of nowhere, I came across something human-made that carried no clear reason, and nothing unsettles me more than a mystery built by someone who wanted it left behind. I had picked the trail almost at random. It wasn't one of the well-known ones, not the kind with polished trip reports or glossy photos posted all over social media. That was part of why I chose it. I wanted something quiet, off the radar. The map showed a loop that wound through deep woods, some elevation changes, a couple of streams to cross. Enough to feel like a proper hike without being too extreme. But the lack of information about it should have told me something. Looking back, that was the first warning sign. The morning started calm. I parked in a gravel pull-off, the kind of spot that looked like it hadn't seen many cars in weeks. My own vehicle sat there alone, the forest pressing tight around it. The air was cool, damp from last night's rain, and the smell of wet earth clung heavy. I laced up my boots, swung my pack over my shoulders, and set off down the trail, which began as nothing more than a pair of ruts pushing into the trees. At first it felt like any other hike. Birds chattered overhead, squirrels darted across fallen logs, and the ground was soft with needles and moss. The trail climbed gradually, weaving between thick trunks, and for a while, I was too focused on the rhythm of my steps to notice anything strange. But slowly, without realizing when it started, I became aware of just how empty the place felt. No other hikers, no distant voices, no sound beyond the occasional crack of a branch under my own weight. 2 miles in, I reached a fork. There was a wooden post with arrows once painted on it, but the markings were faded to gray, barely legible. One arrow pointed left, one right, both trails looking equally overgrown. My map suggested the right path led toward a ridge, so I took it. Almost immediately, the ground grew rougher. Roots clawed across the dirt, rocks jutted out, and the brush closed in on either side. It was clear few people walked this way anymore. As the hours passed, the sense of abandonment deepened. I kept spotting signs that people had been there long ago, but not recently. A rusted can half-buried in the soil. A cut log, the saw marks weathered soft. What really struck me was how old everything looked, like decades had passed since anyone had made use of them. It wasn't just disuse, it was neglect, like the trail had been erased from memory. Around midday, I stopped in a small clearing for a break. I sat on a rock, pulled out some food, and tried to enjoy the quiet. But the quiet wasn't right. The usual background of forest life was missing. No birdsong, no insect hum, just stillness. I chewed slowly, my eyes scanning the trees, expecting to catch movement somewhere, but there was nothing. It felt like the woods were holding their breath, waiting. The longer I sat, the heavier the air felt. I didn't linger after eating. The trail thinned as I went further. At times I had to slow down and search for faded blazes, and other times I lost them completely and had to backtrack. The ground sloped upward, the forest darker and denser. I started to feel like I was walking into a place where people weren't supposed to go anymore. Then, while pushing through a patch of ferns, I saw something that made me stop cold. It was a fire ring, half collapsed, the stones sunken into the dirt. Inside was the black smear of old ash, weathered gray, scattered with rotten wood that had once been logs. Moss crept over the stones, ferns growing out of the center. It was so old it didn't even look like a campfire anymore, more like the ghost of one. But it was unmistakably human. Someone had camped here. Not recently, but someone had once used this spot, deep off the trail. I moved on, unsettled. Soon after, I found other things. A tree scarred with deep axe marks, half-healed but still visible. A broken metal frame, maybe part of an old pack, rusting into the ground. And then, further along, a shoe, or what was left of one. The leather cracked, the sole peeling away, laces gone. It was pressed into the dirt like it had been there for years, forgotten. Each thing I found added weight to the air around me, like I wasn't just hiking anymore. I was trespassing into someone else's history. By late afternoon, the trail gave out entirely. One moment it was faint, but there, the next it was swallowed by undergrowth. I checked my GPS, which showed me standing right on the line, but ahead was only unbroken trees. I pushed forward a bit, thinking maybe it was just overgrown, but it only got worse. The ground turned uneven, rocks jutting up, brush grabbing at my legs. Finally, I had to stop. I wasn't on a trail anymore. That realization hit hard. The sun had already started its slow drop, and I was miles in. My only option was to turn back. I spun around and began retracing my steps, but everything looked different in reverse. The trees, the rocks, the clearings, all blurred together. I tried to remember landmarks, but there hadn't been many. I checked the GPS often, but under the canopy, the accuracy was shaky. Twice I wandered off course and had to double back. Burning daylight I didn't have. At one point during those corrections, I found something that stopped me in my tracks. Against the base of a tree, half hidden in ferns, was a backpack. Old, torn, the fabric bleached by sun and rain. The zippers were rusted, straps fraying. It had clearly been there a long time. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to. The sight of it filled me with a cold dread I can't fully explain. It wasn't just an object. It was a reminder that someone else had been here, and they hadn't made it back. From then on, every step back felt heavier. The woods seemed darker, though the sun was still above the trees. The silence pressed harder, broken only by the occasional faint crack, like something moving far off. Each time I froze, listening, my pulse hammered in my ears, but nothing came closer. I told myself it was animals, but the sound never matched the small scurrying of squirrels or birds. It was heavier, deliberate. I pushed myself harder, sweat soaking through my shirt, legs aching. I wanted out. I needed to see the wide, worn part of the trail again, proof that I wasn't lost. Hours passed, my sense of direction spinning every time the trail fainted and reappeared. At last, just as the light thinned to a dim gray, I stumbled back onto the dry creek bed where I'd stopped for lunch. Relief hit so hard it almost dropped me to my knees. The rest of the hike back was a blur. I moved fast, tripping often, barely caring if I twisted an ankle. The forest closed in, shadows stretching, every sound amplified. When I finally stepped into the parking lot and saw my car sitting alone, I felt something I hadn't all day: safety. I threw my pack inside, climbed in, and locked the doors, even though I knew logically nothing was following me. On the drive home, I kept replaying the day. The fire ring, the axe marks, the shoe, the backpack. None of it fit right. It wasn't just the normal scatter of old campsites or lost gear. It felt like the trail itself had been abandoned for a reason, like the history of what happened there had been left to rot along with the things I found. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the backpack against the tree, sinking into the dirt, waiting. I kept thinking that if I ever mentioned exactly where I had been, people online would dig through old records, old newspapers, searching for names, for stories of hikers who went out there and never came back. And I had no doubt they'd find them. I decided I wouldn't say where it was. Some places are better left without answers. Some trails are forgotten for reasons you can feel even if you can't explain. I had gone far enough to know that, and I knew I wouldn't go back. When I think back to that camping trip, I can still picture the lake first. Wide, dark, ringed by heavy trees that seemed to lean in over the shoreline. The air was damp, the kind of damp that clung to your clothes even when the sun was out. We had picked a spot on the far side of the campground, close enough to the water that you could hear it lapping against the rocks when everything else went quiet. It seemed like the perfect place to get away. Just a couple of tents, a fire pit, and miles of woods around us. The campground wasn't crowded. In fact, for being the most popular place on that lake, it was almost unsettling how empty it felt. A few trailers sat tucked in closer to the entrance, and one family had pitched a tent on the opposite side of the loop, but that was it. No kids riding bikes between the sites, no groups of friends playing music. Just stillness and the occasional sound of an axe splitting wood somewhere off in the trees. We all commented on how strange it felt, but at the time it seemed like a bonus, peace and quiet. The first night passed without anything strange. We cooked over the fire, listened to loons calling from across the water, and went to sleep with that steady quiet pressing in from every side. But sometime in the middle of the second night, I woke up. At first, I thought it was the wind or the sound of water. Then I realized it was different. It was faint, but clear. Laughter. The kind of laughter you recognize instantly as a child's. I lay there on my back, staring up at the thin fabric of the tent, heart thumping. The sound came again. High-pitched, light, drifting across the lake like it carried on the air. It was the kind of sound that should have been comforting, normal even, but in that place, at that hour, it wasn't. It set my nerves on edge. In the morning, I brought it up quietly while we ate breakfast. I wasn't the only one who'd heard it. A couple of the others admitted they'd woken up too, lying still and listening. We all agreed it sounded like children. That's what confused us most. The night before, we'd walked the loop around the campground, and there hadn't been a single kid there. Not one. Just a few older campers and couples. That's what stuck in our minds. There were no children staying at the campground. The day passed normally enough. We hiked a trail along the ridge that gave us views over the entire lake. From up there, you could see every corner of the water, the little bays and coves, the open stretches. It was beautiful but also eerie in its emptiness. A few boats drifted in the distance, and we saw one fisherman casting near shore, but otherwise it was just endless forest and water. From that high vantage point, I thought about how far from everything we really were. That night, the laughter came again. This time it was louder, not just a quick sound carried on the wind, but long bursts of it, like kids playing some game out of sight. It came in waves, sometimes closer, sometimes fainter, but always from the direction of the lake. I sat up in my tent, my chest tight, listening for anything else. Footsteps, splashing, even voices of adults. But it was just laughter, echoing across the water in the dark. We thought about the possibilities the next morning. Maybe some families had arrived late after we went to bed. Maybe someone had brought kids and set up far enough around the shoreline that we hadn't noticed. That explanation would have made sense, but it didn't fit. We had walked past every campsite before dark, and there were no children there. Even the next day, when we passed the other campers and exchanged nods, we saw no signs, no toys, no bikes, no small shoes sitting outside tents. Nothing. That's when it started to weigh heavier. If the laughter wasn't coming from campers, then where was it coming from? The far side of the lake was nothing but dense forest, miles with no trails and no cabins. No one would haul kids out there for the night, and certainly not in the middle of the week. By the third night, it wasn't just laughter. It was movement. I woke to the sound of splashing, like feet hitting the shallow water near shore. I froze, barely breathing. Then came the laughter again, closer now, almost at the edge of camp. I could hear it rise and fall, circling, drifting past, then fading out toward the middle of the lake. My mouth went dry. The others heard it too. In the morning, we didn't say much. No one wanted to admit how unsettled we felt, but it showed in the way we moved, hurried, distracted, always glancing toward the water. On our last day, we decided to walk further down the shoreline, away from the campground. The trail wasn't well kept, more like a deer path winding through thick brush, but it gave us a view of a stretch of the lake where no one camped. That's when we found something that made my stomach turn. Near the waterline, half buried in mud, was a small shoe. A child's sneaker. It was old, the colors faded, the fabric stiff, but it hadn't been there long enough to disappear completely. Next to it, in the sand, were faint depressions, as if small feet had pressed into the soil before the water washed most of it away. We stood there for a long time, staring at it, the silence heavier than ever. That night, the laughter didn't come. The air was dead still, the lake flat as glass. It should have been a relief, but it wasn't. The absence was worse somehow, like whatever had been out there had gone quiet because it knew we were listening too closely. We didn't speak of it when we packed up the next morning. We just loaded the cars in silence and drove away. On the ride home, the unease didn't leave me. I kept running through it in my head. We had thought about every explanation, and the most likely one, that it was just kids playing late at night, didn't fit. There were no children at that campground. Not a single one the entire time we were there. And yet, for 3 nights, laughter had carried across that lake, clear as if it had been right outside our tents. The image that stuck with me most wasn't the laughter itself, though. It was that shoe in the mud, small, abandoned, sinking slowly into the earth. Proof that at some point there had been a child on that shoreline. Whether they ever left, I can't say. But I know what we heard, and I know there was no one there to explain it. When people ask me about that trip, I leave that part out. I talk about the hikes, the quiet, the loons at night. I don't mention the laughter or the shoe. Because deep down, I think if I did, someone would look up the history of that lake, dig through old records and newspapers and find something tragic, something that would explain it in a way I don't want to know. And that's why I'll never camp there again.